frankly, for now, what I'm being told by regional leaders is nothing is going to happen, and Donald Trump never ended up, going through with the orders and the preparation and plan, whatever that may have been. There might be something coming in the future, but for now, the protesters essentially have gone back home.
For the first time this weekend, we've seen the Iranian regime acknowledge the extent of the casualties in the recent protests, which lasted nearly 3 weeks, but they do now seem to have died down. In a live television address yesterday, the Supreme Leader said that the protests had left several thousand people dead. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei also pointed the finger at Donald Trump for encouraging protests, saying that the US was responsible for casualties, damage and slander. Now, today's Sunday Times has obtained a new report from doctors on the ground, which says that at least 16,500 protesters died, and 330,000 more have been injured. And you can read that very powerful article by the brilliant Christina Lamb in today's Sunday Times. And you can also read that piece online at thetimes.com. Well, let's now speak with somebody who's really been following events in Iran very closely, Yalda Hakim. Yalda is lead world news presenter at Sky News. Yalda, welcome to the show. Good afternoon.
Aisha, thank you so much for having me.
Do you feel like these protests are completely over now?
I don't. And I think because the underlying issues haven't been resolved, let's not forget why these protests began. In 2009, Aisha, we saw demonstrations against electoral fraud. We saw demonstrations against the regime flare up again in 2019. And then, of course, the massive demonstrations in 2022, which were dubbed the Women Life Freedom demonstrations. These protests were started by the Bazaris, those in the marketplaces who are running businesses, who are angry about the economic crisis that the country faces. And the economic crisis really came from the fact that, this is a nation that for several decades, because of its policies, because of the Islamic Republic and this particular regime, has faced widespread sanctions from the Western world. And so that has had a direct impact on the average Iranian person, where the price of food, for example, the price of bread has skyrocketed, and people are finding it incredibly difficult to live on a day-to-day basis. So have these protests died down? Yes. But have the underlying issues that many people raised during the protests gone away? No. And I think the fact that it went from being a protest about economic issues, which the government tried to resolve, but then it flared up into something bigger, just goes to show the issues under the surface are going to flare up time and time again. But for now, they have died down.
And as you say, there have been a number of protests, and you're right, these issues will probably flare up again. But we seem to see a cycle of a pattern of behaviour, which is very brave men and women stand up and they get literally kind of crushed and mowed down by the brutality of the regime. I mean, morale must feel very crushed. I mean, we've just been hearing about the numbers of people that have been killed.
Horrific numbers that you were reading there from that Times investigation. And there still isn't any clarity, Aisha, because as you say, there's been an internet blackout. There's been a shutdown for well over a week now. There have been some brave people who have had access to Starlink's, the satellite that allows people to kind of work around it. But I spoke to someone who took the initial Starlinks into Iran back, sort of going back more than 10 years ago. And they were really used during the Women Life Freedom movement. And they've been trained and taught on how to use them. So they turn them on early in the morning. They know when they might be detected. They do it very quickly. They upload what needs to be uploaded, and then they shut it down again. And of course, the authorities were apparently going door to door, trying to find anyone who had these satellites so that they could arrest them, punish them, take the satellites away, so that the international community wouldn't get access to, the things that were going on in the country, because they really did crack down, and the entire regime, including the reformists, closed ranks in the initial stage of these demonstrations when it was just an economic crisis issue. The reformists, the pragmatists, including the president, tried to reach out and speak to the protesters. But then even those guys ended up asking for a crackdown on all of these protesters. And you're right, the numbers are absolutely horrific. I spoke to a guy who managed to leave the country, but he was there last weekend, which is when we believe that the mass killings took place. He told me he went into a cemetery where there was a massive sort of warehouse attached to it. And he said there were up to 4 layers of bodies. And he believes that there was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 bodies just in that particular cemetery on the outskirts of Tehran. So it's hard to get a sense of exactly how many people have been killed, but we know the protests were widespread right around the country. This is a large nation of 90 million or so people, and we know that if not hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people did come out onto the streets.
I just want to read a really interesting point that one of our listeners, Scott, has messaged in with Yalda. He says, "Hello, Aisha. I believe that the Ayatollah and the regime bear full responsibility for the violent crackdown on Iranian protesters. At the same time, I do think there is a point to be made about Donald Trump's role. When he declared that America was locked and loaded and ready to support the Iranian people, it must have given many protesters hope and confidence to take to the streets. But then when no support followed, they were left vulnerable and abandoned." Scott says Trump bears some responsibility in all of this. Words have consequences. What do you think about that? Because a lot of people will feel that these poor protesters were kind of egged on by people like Donald Trump and then no help came. Is there some truth in that?
By Donald Trump and Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, who, kept coming out, giving statements in Farsi, saying to his countrymen, come out every night at 8 p.m., take on this regime. This is a war. And in subsequent interviews that he gave, he said that, people die in these situations, but that is the battle that we are fighting for our freedom. And even mid last week, he said help is on the way. Keep going, keep protesting, the same sort of words that Donald Trump was using. And I spoke to human rights groups and those who have direct contact with many of the protesters inside the country and that young man who fled the country. And he said that they were constantly looking up at the skies for drones, for aircraft, for any sign of help or support from the international community, from the foreign powers that had promised them some kind of support and some kind of help, who had told them, keep going. I mean, we all remember Donald Trump's posts on X where he said, don't stop, keep coming, help is on the way. And these people genuinely thought that there would be a range of options that Donald Trump was looking at, from direct strikes to taking out maybe the top leadership to, doing real damage to this regime and its repressive apparatus, the security forces that are out on the streets. But those who, I had spoken to, including a number of, security and intelligence agencies in the region and regional leaders, said to me they have seen this movie played out before. The regime cracks down on these demonstrations. Sure, the wild card is Donald Trump, and he is unpredictable, and there was uncertainty about what he might do. And the fact is, during the 12-day war last year between Israel and Iran, the United States stepped in, and we saw those B-2 bombers take out certain sites, nuclear sites. But, as you say, when a promise is made that help is on the way, people came out with a level of confidence, believing something would be done. And then, frankly, for now, what I'm being told by regional leaders is nothing is going to happen. And Donald Trump never ended up, going through with the orders and the preparation and plan, whatever that may have been. There might be something coming in the future, but for now, the protesters essentially have gone back home.
And so what does this mean in terms of what comes next? Does this mean that the Ayatollah and his regime have survived this period? The Revolutionary Guard, everything stays in place, and I presume normal citizens will feel pretty cowed right now and very let down and seeing all the sort of murder taking place around them.
Absolutely devastated. I mean, I spoke to members of the diaspora. They told me that in the 13 months leading up to the fall of the Shah and the revolution, the Islamic Revolution in 1979, there were fewer people killed in demonstrations than what we have seen today, just in the course of the last few weeks. This has been a brutal and bloody crackdown where we still don't know the exact numbers. There is an eerie quiet in Tehran today day where some shops have opened up. There are a lot of security forces out on the streets. I mean, Aisha, don't forget, alongside the Revolutionary Guard, which controls every aspect of society from industry to telecommunications, technology, security, there's 150,000 of the Revolutionary Guard that works very closely with the Supreme Leader and the Council. And then there is 1 million Basij, which is like a militia that works out on the streets to crack down. There are 2 million of them who are reservists. So these aren't small numbers. This isn't a joke. The security forces are large. There is still support for the regime in the country, but ultimately the regime, all of its corruption and mismanagement and the rot that you see is leading to a direction where, one has to question whether it can survive. But for now, it has survived to sort of live another day.
And final question to you. What did these protests really achieve other than all of these terrible deaths?
That's a really great question, Aisha. During the Women Life Freedom demonstrations, one of the core demands from the people out on the streets, the teenage girls, the women who went out and bravely took on the regime and the security forces, one of their key demands was more freedom for women, the compulsory hijab not to be mandatory. And to some extent, the regime met their demands. You now can see in the streets of Tehran fewer veils, fewer headscarves. Women took on the regime and they go out and the morality police don't crack down in the same way that they used to. The core question here is, what did these protesters get out of it? They were protesting against an economic crisis and then the downfall of the regime. Have the sanctions been eased? No. Will life be easier now for the Iranian people? No. Is the regime still there? Yes. Big question is, what has been achieved?
Well, look, Yalda, really, really good to speak with you. Thank you so much. You've got such insight into this. I mean, but a very, very, very sad outcome, and just those poor people who lost their lives and were injured. Absolutely terrible. Yalda, thank you so much for your time. That's Yalda Hakim there from Sky.